Thank you so much. And I think that they didn't update the bio yet because I did
Oh,
get promoted to associate professor. So
oh,
since I,
congratulations.
so that's been exciting and a big change in my life. Thank you. I'm just going to start my PowerPoint, but before I do that, I want to thank everyone for coming and being here today. I want to thank Bridge for organizing this. He's been great to correspond with and very helpful. And I also want to thank the two discussants that you managed to wrangle in to do this talk. I can't actually think of two better people to have a conversation about this book. And both of them, whose work I really admire, I'm really actually looking forward to the conversation that we have after this is over. So let me just share my screen. Okay. And I can't actually see, I have to share have mine in full screen. So I'm assuming that this is working. So I'm going to try to keep my presentation a little bit short so that we can field questions and engage everyone who is present here. I know that there are sort of some contemporary resonations with my presentation that, of what's going on in contemporary China that some people like to bring up. And I'm always happy to field those questions in the question and answer. So I'm hoping that we can have a good and lively conversation about this. Okay. So the book that I'm here to talk about today, I'm going to explore a couple of the themes that I sort of that I hope that I brought out in the book and look at them in a little bit of detail. And I would like to talk a little bit about the sort of way that I came to this research project. And then I'm going to sort of preempt the talk with a couple of the conclusions that I make in this book. And then talk about, a couple of the specific policies that I sort of draw out in the book that I see as the Japanese Empire having utilized first towards Muslims in China and later towards Muslims living further out throughout the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere and even beyond that. So I came to this project sort of haphazardly and sort of almost by accident through a lot of different classes that I took throughout my graduate courses. And one of the things that really struck me, I took a course on collaboration during World War II with a professor named Aviel Roschwald. And he mentioned, we wrote we had this whole class about collaboration during World War II. And there was really only one book about China, and that was Tim Brooks' collaboration from 2008. And so I started to think a little bit about why there were no works on collaboration in China and what that meant for, East Asia in the post-war era. And then I started to sort of think about, well, Tim Brooks' work is really interesting and thoughtful and thought-provoking, but it really only deals with Han Chinese. And I was really interested in Sino-Muslims or Muslims who live in China's periphery. So I started thinking about these questions about why and how the Japanese Empire would collaborate or work with Muslims from China, and why Muslims from China would work with the Japanese Empire in order to sort of fulfill some of their imperial objectives. And so some of the objectives that I had when I wrote this book were to insert Sino-Muslims into the historiography of World War II. And just quickly, for people who might be here and might not be familiar with who Sino-Muslims are or Chinese Muslims, these are people that are sort of distinct from groups that we might consider, groups that are considered to be part of the Chinese nation state today that are also Muslims, such as the Uyghurs, the Tajiks, the Kazakhs. And Chinese Muslims are really spread out through all over China. They are mostly ethnically Han Chinese or look Han Chinese, and they use Chinese as their first language. So they sort of work and act oftentimes as intermediaries between the state and other ethnic minority groups or minorities living within China. And that's important just because of their sort of maneuvering and their positionality as oftentimes being not only in conflict with the state, but in cooperation with the state. I also wanted to help to sort of begin to reinstate agency to Sino-Muslims living in the early 20th century state building projects in China, which is something I think is happening in the broader historiography of modern China, is that, people are starting to acknowledge the important contributions that the peripheries and peoples living in the peripheries paid to building and constructing what we would now consider to be the modern Chinese nation state. And to examine state building efforts on the margins and among non-Han Chinese populations. So with that in mind, today I'm going to sort of briefly examine 3 tangible policies that I look at in my book, which were the supporting and opening of Islamic schools, sending Hajj delegations to Mecca, and a coordinated global tea policy, and thinking about the ways that the Japanese Empire was really looking for large markets beyond what we would consider to be the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, and sending people beyond the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere in an effort to sort of create a perhaps larger market than we might acknowledge in the current historiography. And then we have this process of building the empire, in which I argue that through propaganda, which featured Muslims as sort of success stories of the quote unquote benevolence of the Japanese empire, the Japanese empire was sort of able to present itself as a liberator, as a supporter of religious freedom, as a place where Muslims could practice freely. And I think that this was, a policy that the Nazis also used, the Italians also emulated and tried to use in North Africa. And we can be, in the aftermath, we can be cynical and, be cynical about these policies. What the Nazis were doing in the Balkans and what the Nazis were doing throughout the Middle East with the Mufti of Jerusalem, and what Mussolini was doing in North Africa, in Libya. The contradictions between what they were saying and what they were actually doing are clear and inherent. But I think that we need to sort of be cognizant of people who were living at this time, really saw especially the Japanese Empire as an alternative to Western imperialism or Soviet communism. And in this regard, through propaganda, which appealed to anti-Soviet and anti-imperial inclinations, these were sentiments that were already held by many Muslims. So in many cases, on the Chinese mainland, the options for people to sort of work with different groups were really, working with the Soviets, working with the KMT, working with the CCP, or perhaps, aligning themselves with some sort of British interest or American interests, be that pretty far flung. But that, in some ways, I think for a lot of people, the Japanese Empire seems the lesser of all of the evils. And perhaps working with them would allow them to achieve some of the goals that they themselves were attempting to implement and take care of. So in terms of the research questions that I came to this project with, I guess, I was interested in what the Japanese motivations were for supporting Muslims in China, and what did they hope to benefit from doing this. I think that that's an important question to sort of think about, what the overall intention or what the aspiration of the Japanese Empire was for these projects that they were implementing in North China and later throughout their empire. Next question that I wanted to answer was, were they successful, and why and how? Some people have offered some criticism saying that, I'm apologizing for the Japanese Empire in some ways in my book. And, I'm sensitive to that criticism, but I don't think that we can forget the fact that at this time, in 1942 and in 1943, it did look like the Japanese were potentially going to win the war. And for a lot of people who were sort of hedging their bets and making decisions about where they wanted to sort of go in the future, I think probably Japan presented quite a different and interesting way forward for people who were living throughout Asia and had concerns about Asian solidarity and who were thinking about what a post-war world would look like. Of course, in the aftermath of the war, all of these things change really quickly. But considering whether or not policies were successful or not is not meant to sort of, validate them. And what do their efforts tell us about the position of Muslims in China in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s? So the fact that the Japanese were so quickly or able to, find willing collaborators and people to work with them in North China, I think really sort of shows some of the hollowness of the KMT's ethno-nationalist policies in the 1920s and 1930s, and sort of allows us to see that when, in retrospect, as the PRC sort of presents China as completely resistant to the Japanese during the war, this sort of helps complicate that narrative and show that people did have alternative visions for perhaps a post-war future or a future for themselves within a different vision of a Chinese nation state. And then finally, how did the Chinese nationalists and Chinese communists respond? So the conclusions that I come to is that the Japanese were successful in recruiting Muslim populations in occupied China through specific programs and policies, but only to a certain degree. And, I think that the Chinese Muslim population that I'm dealing with was able to push back on Japanese policies because they really understood their inherent value to the Japanese imperial project. So they were able to maneuver within this. It wasn't sort of a direct imposition of policy. Excuse me. And the Chinese nationalists and the Chinese communists were also very well aware of Japanese efforts to curry favors to Muslims. And they did respond to these in kind. And I think the sort of most present in the literature expression of this is these sort of competing Hajjs that took place, the KMT supported Hajj and the Japanese supported Hajj in 1938 and 1939. So some of the other conclusions, the bigger conclusions that I draw are that Sino-Muslims who participated in empire building projects became what Robert Cruz identifies as imperial cosmopolitans in his book, Afghan Modern. And, these people were traveling around the world with the help of the Japanese Empire. They were meeting people from all over the world and making connections with people they might otherwise not be able to meet, and really sort of understanding the world through different eyes as they traveled extensively and met people around the world. So I think it's important for us to, think about the fact that as they participated in these sort of these networks that were facilitated by the Japanese Empire, they really saw, Tokyo really sort of became an essential part of of where people who were either exiled from the British Empire or from Dutch empires throughout Southeast Asia and South Asia found themselves. And so these people are in a constant conversation and really sort of sharing their ideas and sharing knowledge about Islam and the Muslim world. And I think another important conclusion that I'm making is that there was really never a united Muslim voice of resistance against the Japanese in World War II, but rather a plethora of competing voices and agendas. And, of course, my work really only deals with Muslims who were working with the Japanese Empire, but I know that there are a number of people working on, the competing voices. So Muslims who were either backing the CCP or working with the KMT. And in the words of Adib Khalid in his fabulous book from 2015 about making Uzbekistan, the Japanese were able to locate different actors and examine how they mobilized both symbolically and materially to achieve their goals. So in some ways, I think they were quite successful in locating Sino-Muslim interlocutors for their projects. So I'm going to sort of shift gears now and talk more about three specific policies that I deal with in chapters 2, chapters 3, and chapters 4. And this is the opening of Muslim schools in North China and in Manchukuo. And this really starts with the fact that I think the Japanese empire really had to come to terms with the fact that if they were going to extend their quote unquote benevolence to Muslims around the world, they really needed to reconcile the fact that there were very few Muslims actually living in Japan, and Japanese subjects, except for a few intellectuals and elite men and women, really didn't know very much about Islam at all. And so in this sort of propaganda push to present themselves as protectors of Islam, they had a couple of groups of people that they were sort of able to draw on and utilize extensively in propaganda throughout the 1930s and 1940s to sort of showcase this. And one group was this group of Tatars, Volga Tatars, who had made their way to Tokyo via Siberia, escaping Bolshevik persecution, and had settled in Tokyo and sort of established a community there. And they built a small mosque and an Islamic school. And so here, this is from 1936, so even before the war started properly in China in 1937. Here, the pupils of the Islamic school in Tokyo pray for the success of the Japanese-German alliance against Bolshevism. So these types of images would help Japanese subjects and help people living in the Japanese Empire to sort of understand that they were projecting themselves as supporters of Islam. And so this is from a children's journal called Kodomo, meaning child, obviously. And it's a sort of 4 or 5 page spread about the young children who are learning what we would call, what is not actually Arabic. It's a Central Asian language as well as Japanese. They're learning that in school, and they are, participating in these sort of empire, I guess you could call it empire building, but really it's to sort of show to young children that there are children that perhaps don't look like them, that perhaps don't believe the same things as them, but they are also a part of the Japanese empire, and it's the part of the Japanese empire's job to protect them. And then here's another photo of one of these young children learning in Tokyo, obviously learning Japanese in Tokyo, taken in 1942. So, by the time of the establishment of Manchukuo in 1932, I think the Japanese Empire kind of had developed a playbook for sort of how to think about Muslim populations, how to deal with them. And I sort of mark 1932 as a divide in the policies towards Muslims, in that up until then, it was quite sort of haphazard, and they were trying to sort of figure out how to manage different types of groups like these Tatars and how to sort of utilize them to achieve their imperial aspirations. But then at the same time, by 1932, we have the opening of Muslim schools. And here you can see the Manchukuo flag with the Japanese flag. And this is obviously a Muslim elementary school opening in China, in North China. So one of the things that happened was that when they actually began trying to implement curriculum changes in these schools throughout North China, was that they often faced pushback because part of the curriculum changes that they were trying to institute were to teach Japanese and to teach Japanese language. And I think for a lot of Muslims, that really was understood as or Muslim parents was really understood as an infringement on their either Arabic or Persian classes that the children were taking. And they were trying to sort of figure out how to negotiate and manage how the ways that they would be able to maintain the amount of Arabic that they would be learning in school while also finding somewhere to fit Japanese. And so I see this as sort of this sort of contested space of languages that I talk about pretty extensively, in that Chinese sort of was obviously understood as the language of daily life. Japanese became what parents understood to be as a sort of bureaucratic language that could either, help serve their children or serve their families. If their kids could learn Japanese, it would actually potentially be helpful, especially if you're thinking about 1941, 1942, 1943, and you're living under the Japanese occupation, could present opportunities, and it often did, to young students. And then finally, Arabic is, understood as the liturgical language, and really it becomes this contested space where Japanese and Arabic are sort of fighting for space in classroom time. And I think that what am I trying to say? For a lot of these children, going to these Japanese schools and learning Japanese really presented them with opportunities that they might not have otherwise had. And I think this is especially true for young women. There were a lot of conversations and debates among Muslims in China in the 1920s and 1930s about opening schools for women. And there was one that had opened in the 1920s that sort of failed. It didn't really work that well. But the Japanese did provide spaces for young women. And one of the things that I noticed is whenever they were hosting these language competitions, generally young women, young Muslim women, or young Han women, or young Mongolian women would win them. So I think it was really an interesting place and space for time for young women that perhaps might not have had the opportunity to either go to school or learn a different language. And in this case, a couple of these young women got the opportunity to visit Tokyo and leave North China and go to what was then the Imperial capital. So, this was probably a life-changing experience for many of these young women. And I think that, sort of reconciling the fact that, of course, they were living under occupation, but they got to, leave the occupation, go and have this experience that many people, to this day don't even get to have, to visit Tokyo, I think is probably something that is worth thinking about and acknowledging. And then also the Japanese propaganda regarding schools extended to the Middle East. And these are obviously Japanese school children, but this is really showing the ways that Japanese schools operated in in Japan to Muslims around the world. So sort of tying these two policy objectives together, supporting the faith and building the empire, sort of come together in this way, in that they're trying to show the rest of the world how modern, how good their schools are, how well behaved their school children are, as a model to sort of emulate throughout perhaps other parts of the world. And then, I make the case that a lot of these policies began in Manchukuo, and then as the Japanese Empire expanded throughout Southeast Asia, into Indonesia, the Philippines, and other Burma, many of the mostly young men, a couple young women that sort of came under the service of empire, were also brought and made their way to Tokyo to sort of learn. So these models that were sort of established in North China were then replicated, very quickly and often haphazardly throughout the spaces that they occupied. And these are three young Moro men studying from the Philippines studying Japanese and also to become police officers in Tokyo in 1943. So now I'm going to shift gears, and this is a story that many people are probably familiar with, to talk a little bit about the opening of the Tokyo Grand Mosque. And so before this, there had been 2 other mosques that opened in Tokyo, in Japan. Both of them had opened with really the support of private benefactors, mostly coming from South Asian money, people from South Asia who were living and working as traders in Japan at the time. So this is the 3rd mosque. The other ones are in Kobe and Nagoya. And this is the Tokyo Mosque, which was built almost entirely with funds from the Japanese government. So it's a sort of different type of project. It's not raised by private benefactors, but supported entirely by the Japanese government, or almost entirely by the Japanese government. And in the book, I argue that this was a sort of gesture that was made. This became an important space. It was a political space. It was not just a spiritual space, and it was meant to sort of showcase this sort of quote unquote benevolence that I talk about. So at the opening ceremonies, the Japanese invited Muslims from all around the world. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the people who were at these opening ceremonies, but many Axis-aligned countries, as well as countries from Southeast Asia with Muslim populations, sent delegations to the opening of the mosque, which not only became a celebration about this new spiritual space, or this new space, but became a sort of way to showcase the technological, military, and economic superiority of the Japanese Empire, because all of the people who went to visit Japan for this were then taken on a tour of Japan to visit naval bases, to visit military bases, to visit factories, and things like this. So a couple of the people that were at this event, this is Prince Hussein of Yemen, who is arriving at the Tokyo station. Before arriving in Tokyo, he spent a number of days in Shanghai, and then occupied Shanghai, and then made his way to Tokyo. And he is there as a representative of Yemen, as a part of an inter-Axis alliance. At the time, the Italians and the Yemenis had a very important friendship treaty that was meant to provide arms and support to the Yemenis to resist British incursion into their territory on the Arabian Peninsula. So, here he comes as a sort of representative of Yemen, but also to show the support of these sort of Axis connections. And this is Hafiz Wahab, who is an Egyptian-born Saudi representative arriving at Haneda Airport in 1938. So Wahab is going to go on to become the first ambassador to the Vatican, and as well as one of the first 2 directors of the Arabian American Oil Company. And this is kind of interesting that, the Saudis decide to send to Japan and to the Vatican someone who is not actually part of the Saudi royal family, but is someone who is born Egyptian and becomes, an important diplomatic ally to the Saudis. He's naturalized as a Saudi, but, he's not, he's actually Egyptian. So he's, I don't know, I just think it's kind of interesting that they decide to send someone who is not Saudi to Japan, which is obviously not a Muslim country, as well as to live in the Vatican. So again, from the perspective of the mosque opening, I think it becomes clear that this was a success in terms of propaganda. And in 1938, there's sort of global recognition from both Muslim and non-Muslim countries. So we have a Dutch newspaper here. So these are from the diplomatic archives in Japan, a Dutch newspaper and an Arabic newspaper sort of writing news stories about this new mosque that is opening up. And while at the opening of the mosque, there was a delegation of Chinese Muslims who went. So here's members of the Japanese-sponsored Chinese Muslim Association visiting the Meiji Shrine in 1938. And while they were on this trip, they were asked by the Japanese government to go on a Japanese-sponsored Hajj. And this is the main story that I tell in chapter 3 of my book about one of the men, a man named Tang Yichen, who was asked to sort of recruit a number of representatives and go on a Hajj sponsored by the Japanese government. So the most of the information that I have about this is from a journal from a man named Tang. It was published in 1943, so obviously after the trip was taken, and he writes extensively about his journey and how difficult it was. So for the purpose of this sort of talking about these inter-axis connections and the ways that the axis was sort of looking at each other and figuring out how to maneuver Muslim populations, I think one of the most important or striking things that comes out of this journal for me is that obviously many of the places that Tang and his companions are going to be stopping on this Japanese-sponsored Hajj are under British control at the time. So obviously Hong Kong, Singapore, Colombo, Mumbai. And what these men quickly find out when they arrive in Shanghai to get visas to go on their Hajj is that the British are not going to give them visas. So they sort of scramble around. They wonder if perhaps they should go overland through Xinjiang. And they finally are given visas by the Italians. So they take an Italian ship to Eritrea. In a couple places, they don't get off their ship. When they do get off the ship, they are met frequently by a very, very well-informed network of KMT operatives who are there to greet them, especially in Singapore and in Mumbai. So it sort of shows that the KMT had these sort of overseas Chinese networks of Chinese who were living in different places throughout the world who did know that these men were traveling on this Hajj. And then they spend a while in Eritrea, which is under Italian control at the time. And they make their way finally across to Mecca and to Jeddah and perform their Hajj. And while on the Hajj, they have a number of important meetings with some Saudi diplomats and Saudi officials which sort of lays the groundwork for Saudi negotiations with the Japanese for an oil concession in Saudi Arabia. And this eventually falls through, as we all know, leading the Japanese to look other places for oil. So in the third sort of part of this story that I'm telling, I think one of the things that sort of surprised me, and I came across these documents at the Diet Library, was the ways that the Japanese Empire was trying to connect not only Muslims from China, but Muslims around the world to its economic policies and its export policies. And I sort of centered in on tea, but I think that there's a lot of opportunity to look at other commodities. And really what I'm trying to argue in these chapters is that the Japanese Empire, when we think of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, it can be kind of limiting in the ways that I think in the 1940s, the Japanese Empire was looking at their imperial aspirations and imperial ambitions. And they were really trying to sort of create commercial networks and export networks to places well beyond this network. And one of the ways that they were hoping to do this was through the sale of tea, which was, a very important global commodity. So here are just some charts, about this quote unquote global policy to the Muslim world, and looking at the sort of different exports, the amount of exports, where the tea is coming from. The China tea there is, so the Japanese tea is tea from Japan and also from Formosa. And then the China tea is tea from the Chinese mainland, and where those tea is going, and who is buying Japanese tea and tea that is under Japanese imperial control at the time. So, that's kind of the bigger question that I'm sort of positing, and I think an interjection that I'm trying to make is that as historians of modern imperial Japanese history, perhaps looking beyond the sort of confines of what we would consider to be the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere might yield some really interesting research results and allow us to sort of look back onto the metropole in new and insightful ways. So in the time that I have left, I'm just going to take a couple minutes to sort of talk about a little bit briefly about my next project, which is sort of going to extend my first book into the 50s and 60s. And I'm really interested in sort of bringing together ideas of Islamic internationalism and Islamic cooperation between Muslims from the end of the Second World War into the 1950s and early 1960s into the conversation about how Muslims in East Asia, specifically in post-occupation Japan, in KMT Taiwan, and in the new PRC state that is established in 1949, how they think about their position in relation to Muslim populations around the world in this like rapidly changing geopolitical situation. So how they deal with post-colonial states, how they interact with Muslims who are, pro-CCP or pro-KMT, and how that all sort of flutters out. So it's obviously a huge project, and I'm just getting started. But here, this is a telegram. This is actually from Taiwan, from Academia Sinica, a telegram from the Chinese Muslim Association that was established by Bai Chongxi actually established in Hong Kong and then moved to the Chinese to Taiwan, congratulating Suharto on assuming power after his coup in Indonesia. So really, the Chinese Muslims living in Taiwan saw this coup as really important because they saw it as a way to that it was possible and potential to overthrow a communist regime. And so they really looked to Suharto's regime at this time as an important way to sort of promote pan-Islamic solidarity in retaking the Chinese mainland from the Chinese communists. So it really here, I'm trying to insert myself into an important conversation. There's such a lot of really great work done on Islam, or the East Asian Cold War, and more is emerging. But what I find lacking in this story is sort of the voices of Muslims themselves. So, I mentioned, and maybe some of you were here, that I was hoping to go to Stanford. I had a grant to go to Stanford. It's been stopped because of COVID, to go and work with Bai Chongxi's papers, as well as looking at sort of the individual writings of Muslims in the 1950s and 1960s to see what they themselves are thinking about this rapidly changing geopolitical situation. And to sort of plug some of my new work, I do have a paper coming out in May 2022. It's volume 47, number 2 of a journal called 20th Century China, which is called Cold War Mosque, Islam and Politics in Nationalist Taiwan, that examines some of these questions that I'm sort of trying to raise and starting to think about. And then obviously I would like to bring post-occupation Japan into this story and tell the story of, there are a number of works in English and in Japanese that sort of look at state-to-state interactions between individual nation states and Japan, such as like Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Japan. But again, what I'm missing from a lot of these works is a sort of on-the-ground maneuvering and who's doing the talking and who's doing the negotiating and what they're talking about and how they're thinking about themselves in terms of contributing to some of the larger anti-imperial, anti-colonial, anti-Western movements throughout the 1950s and 1960s. And then I'll just end here to sort of bring it au courant. Here are some Sino-Muslim leaders meeting with Xi Jinping, obviously the father of the current secretary of the CCP, General Secretary of the CCP and President of China, Xi Jinping's father in the 1950s. So just sort of, I think that this sort of helps demonstrate some of the continuities in disjunctures in the ways that some of these countries in East Asia understood the utility and saw Muslim actors as sort of being an important part of their nation state building efforts. And perhaps we could argue that that has changed, but that might be something for conversation in the question and answer period. So thank you so much. I'm going to end this now. I'm going to stop presenting. And I'm really looking forward to a conversation about what I've brought up here today.